The private jet hummed softly at 30,000 feet, its leather seats gleaming under warm cabin lights. Amara Johnson sat by the window, her posture relaxed, but her gaze sharp. Across the aisle, Clara Whitaker adjusted a champagne flute with unnecessary force, her eyes darting to Amara every few seconds. Amara reached to adjust her seatbelt, her fingers brushing the emergency exit panel. Clara's voice cut through the silence, sharp and condescending. "Don't touch that." Amara paused, her hand hovering mid-air. She turned slowly to face Clara. "Excuse me?" Clara stepped closer, her polished heels clicking against the floor. "You heard me. This isn't a playground." Amara's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm aware," she said calmly. The other passengers glanced over, wealthy, mostly white, before quickly looking away. A man in a tailored suit cleared his throat awkwardly and flipped open a magazine. Clara crossed her arms, her tone dripping with faux professionalism. "We have rules here. Not that you'd understand." Amara leaned back in her seat, her voice steady but edged with ice. "Rules or your assumptions?" Clara's cheeks flushed. "I don't have time for this." She turned to walk away, but Amara's next words stopped her cold. "Do you treat all passengers this way?" Amara asked quietly. "Or just the ones who look like me?" The cabin fell silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. Clara's irritation boiled over as she turned sharply back toward Amara. Her steps were quick, her face tight with barely concealed anger. Without warning, she slapped Amara's arm, her voice snapping like a whip. "I said don't touch that!" The sound echoed through the cabin, louder than it should have been, cutting through the soft hum of the jet engines. Amara froze for a moment, her arm still resting on the edge of her seat. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes locked onto Clara's with an intensity that made the flight attendant falter slightly. The passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. A woman in pearls glanced toward the scene but quickly turned back to her tablet, pretending not to notice. A man adjusted his cufflinks and stared out the window as though he hadn't heard a thing. Clara straightened her posture, trying to regain control of the moment. "You don't just go around touching things on private jets," she said sharply, her tone dripping with condescension. Amara's voice was calm but deliberate when she replied, "I wasn't aware adjusting my seatbelt was a crime." Clara scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "This isn't a commercial flight, sweetheart. Know your place." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking the silence that followed. Amara's gaze didn't waver, her calm composure now sharper than any retort could have been. The tension in the cabin was palpable, every passenger pretending not to see what was happening while clearly feeling its weight. Clara shifted uncomfortably under Amara's steady gaze but said nothing more. Amara exhaled slowly and adjusted her seatbelt without another word. The cabin felt suffocatingly quiet now, the hum of the jet engines drowned out by the weight of what had just happened. Amara sat still, her expression composed but her eyes sharp, fixed on Clara Whitaker, who stood rigidly a few feet away. Amara broke the silence, her voice calm but cutting. "Do you treat all passengers this way, or just the ones who look like me?" Clara flinched slightly but quickly masked it with a sneer. "I don't know what you're implying," she said coldly. "But this isn't a commercial flight, sweetheart. You don't get to act like you own the place." Amara tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Own the place?" she repeated softly. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Clara crossed her arms tightly, her confidence faltering under Amara's steady gaze. "You wouldn't understand how things work here," she muttered weakly, avoiding eye contact now. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in pearls glanced briefly at Amara before turning back to her tablet, her movements stiff with unease. A man near the aisle adjusted his tie and cleared his throat awkwardly, pretending to read an in-flight magazine he hadn't opened until now. Amara leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough to force Clara to meet her eyes. "You assume a lot about me. she said calmly. "But let me make one thing clear. You've crossed a line." Clara opened her mouth to respond but faltered under Amara's unflinching gaze. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on everyone in the cabin like a storm cloud waiting to break. The silence in the cabin was unbearable now, thick and oppressive. Clara Whitaker stood frozen, her arms still crossed, but her confidence had begun to crack. Her gaze darted to the other passengers, searching for support, but no one met her eyes. Amara Johnson sat still for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of her seat. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stood. The quiet creak of the leather seat as she rose seemed louder than it should have been. Clara took a small step back, her bravado slipping further. "I don't know what you're trying to prove," she said, her voice faltering slightly. Amara didn't reply. Immediately, she adjusted her jacket with calm precision before turning to face Clara fully. Her voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "You're fired." The words landed like a thunderclap. Clara blinked in confusion, her mouth opening and closing, as though searching for a response. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her tone suddenly unsure. Amara's expression didn't change as she stepped closer, her movements deliberate but unthreatening. "This is my jet," she said evenly. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively as the weight of Amara's words settled over everyone. Clara's face drained of color as realization dawned. "You can leave now," Amara added quietly, her tone final. Clara's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. She glanced around the cabin again, hoping for someone, anyone, to intervene on her behalf. But the other passengers avoided her gaze entirely, their discomfort palpable. Amara remained composed, her calm authority filling the space as Clara's arrogance crumbled under the weight of her mistake. Clara Whitaker stood frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly at her sides. The realization of what she had just done, and who she had done it to, was sinking in fast. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Amara Johnson remained calm, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need to say anything more. The silence was doing all the work. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in a tailored suit adjusted his watch, unnecessarily his eyes fixed on the floor. A woman in pearls fidgeted with her scarf, sneaking a glance at Clara before quickly looking away. Clara turned to them, desperation creeping into her voice. "You all saw what happened," she said, her words shaky but laced with a faint attempt at authority. "This is ridiculous." No one responded. The man with the watch coughed awkwardly, still avoiding eye contact. The woman with the scarf busied herself with her tablet, pretending not to hear. Clara's confidence crumbled further as she looked back at Amara, who hadn't moved an inch. "I didn't mean," Clara began, but Amara cut her off with a single raised hand. "You've done enough," Amara said quietly, her tone sharp but controlled. Clara's shoulders sagged as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She glanced around the cabin one last time, hoping for some kind of support, but all she found were eyes that turned away. Amara exhaled slowly and returned to her seat without another word. The cabin remained silent except for the faint hum of the engines, a silence heavy with judgment and finality. The sound of conveyor belts filled the air, a mechanical hum that never seemed to stop. Amara Johnson stood in the dimly lit baggage room of a bustling airport, her hands moving swiftly. As she loaded suitcases onto carts, the air smelled faintly of jet fuel and worn leather, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the rows of luggage around her. Her co-workers laughed loudly nearby, their voices bouncing off the concrete walls. "You're wasting your time, Amara!" one of them called out, his tone mocking but not malicious. "Dreaming about flying up there when you're stuck down here?" Amara didn't respond. She adjusted her gloves and kept working, her mind racing with ideas even as her hands moved mechanically. "Seriously," another coworker chimed in, leaning against a cart. "You think they're going to let someone like you run things? Come on." Amara paused for just a moment, her fingers tightening around the handle of a suitcase. She turned to face them, her expression calm but firm. "Why not?" she asked simply. The group exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. One of them shook his head and said, "Because that's not how this works." Amara didn't argue. She turned back to her work. But her thoughts were steady. "If they won't let me in, I'll find my own way." The camera lingered on her as she loaded the last suitcase onto the cart and pushed it toward the loading dock. Her movements were deliberate, each step carrying the weight of determination. Above her, a plane roared to life on the tarmac, its shadow briefly passing over the baggage room window. Amara glanced up at it for a moment before returning to her task. The sound of laughter faded into the background. The boardroom was sleek and imposing, its polished mahogany table stretching across the room like a barrier. Amara Johnson sat at one end, her hands resting lightly on a stack of neatly printed documents. The walls were lined with framed photos of successful aviation ventures, each one a silent reminder of the industry's exclusivity. She inhaled deeply before standing, her posture straight but not rigid. "Thank you all for your time," she began, her voice steady but deliberate. "I believe this proposal can reshape private aviation by making it more accessible without compromising luxury or efficiency." The room was silent as Amara presented her ideas. Her words were clear, her vision sharp, but the faces staring back at her remained unreadable. One man in a tailored suit glanced at his watch. Another scribbled notes without looking up. When she finished, there was a brief pause before one of the investors leaned back in his chair and said, "It's ambitious, but I'm not sure this is the right direction for our clientele." Another investor chimed in, his tone dismissive. "It's interesting, but it feels premature." Amara nodded politely and gathered her documents, her expression calm despite the sting of their words. "Thank you for considering it," she said quietly before leaving the room. Weeks later, Amara sat in the break room, scrolling through her phone, when an article caught her eye. "Visionary Proposal Revolutionizes Private Aviation." The name beneath the headline wasn't hers. It was one of the investors from that meeting. Her chest tightened as she read the details of her own pitch repackaged and praised as groundbreaking. She set her phone down slowly, her thoughts steady. "They took my idea because they didn't think I deserved it." Amara didn't cry or rage. She simply stood and walked back to work, her resolve stronger than ever. The office was cold and clinical, its walls lined with abstract art that seemed more about status than taste. Amara Johnson sat across from an investor whose tailored suit and polished demeanor screamed authority. His desk was immaculate, save for a single folder containing her proposal. He flipped through the pages lazily, his expression unreadable. Amara watched him closely, her posture straight but unthreatening. She had rehearsed this meeting in her mind 100 times. But now, faced with his indifference, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "This is impressive," he said finally, his tone flat. "You clearly know the industry." Amara nodded slightly, waiting for him to continue. "But," he added, leaning back in his chair, "I'm not sure this is the right time or the right person for something like this." Amara's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her chair. "What do you mean by the right person?" she asked calmly. The investor smiled faintly, a practiced gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "You're talented," he said, as if offering her a consolation prize. "But this industry isn't ready for someone like you." Amara's chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "Then I'll make it ready." The investor blinked, caught off guard by her quiet defiance. He cleared his throat and closed the folder with a soft thud. "Best of luck," he said dismissively, gesturing toward the door. Amara stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She didn't bother thanking him as she walked out of the office. Her thoughts were steady. "They'll regret underestimating me." The camera lingered on the investor as he leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly to himself. Outside the office, Amara stepped into the sunlight, her resolve unshaken. The cabin was silent, the tension thick enough to cut through. Clara Whitaker stood frozen, her face pale and her confidence shattered. Amara Johnson sat calmly, her posture composed, her authority filling the space without effort. Across the aisle, Elijah Carter, a black filmmaker seated quietly near the window, adjusted his phone in his lap. He had been watching the entire exchange unfold, the slap, the condescending remarks, and Amara's calm declaration. "This is my jet." Elijah pressed record discreetly, capturing Clara's faltering arrogance and Amara's quiet power. The camera focused on Clara's trembling hands as she struggled to process what had just happened. Amara leaned back in her seat, her voice steady but sharp. "You can leave now." Clara opened her mouth to respond but faltered under Amara's unflinching gaze. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on everyone in the cabin like a storm cloud. Elijah stopped recording and glanced at his screen. The clip was just over 2 minutes long, short enough to hold attention but powerful enough to spark outrage. He tapped the upload button and watched as the video began circulating online almost instantly. Within hours, notifications flooded in. Comments, shares, likes. The caption read, "CEO versus flight attendant, accountability wins." The video spread like wildfire, reaching thousands within minutes. Comments poured in. "This happened to me last week. Fire her. We need more leaders like Amara. Ibrabiasu." Evening. The hashtag or airborne racism was trending globally, amplifying voices that had been silenced for far too long. Amara sat quietly in her office later that night, scrolling through the posts. Each story felt personal, an echo of her own experiences reflected back at her. Her thoughts were steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." The newsroom buzzed with restrained energy, the kind that ripples just before a storm breaks. Screens flickered with the now viral clip of Clara Whitaker slapping Amara Johnson, followed by Amara's calm declaration, "This is my jet." The clip played on a loop, each replay amplifying the tension in the room. At one desk, a young reporter adjusted his earpiece, his voice low but tense as he spoke into the microphone. "We live in 3-2. He paused, then began with measured precision. The video has sparked outrage across social media, with many calling it a clear example of systemic racism in luxury industries. Across the room, 2 senior anchors sat at their desk, their expressions carefully neutral as they prepared for their segment. The producer's voice crackled in their earpieces. "We're leading with the clip. Keep it sharp. Don't editorialize too much." The lead anchor glanced at her co-host, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think this is just one bad apple?" Her co-host hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "It's hard to ignore the patterns when you look closely," he replied quietly. On air, their voices were steady but laced with tension. "Is this an isolated incident?" the anchor asked pointedly, "or a symptom of deeper issues in aviation and beyond?" The camera cut to footage of Clara's face mid-sneer, then to Amara's composed response. The contrast was stark, arrogance unraveling against quiet dignity. In the corner of the newsroom, a junior journalist scrolled through social media on her phone. She paused on a comment that read, "This isn't new, it's just finally being seen." Her chest tightened as she typed out her own post. How many more stories like this are out there? The newsroom fell silent for a moment as the weight of the story settled over them all. The small interview room was stark and quiet, its walls bare except for a clock that ticked softly in the background. Priya Patel sat at the edge of her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a former cleaner at the airline, and though she had left the job years ago, the memories of her time there lingered like shadows she couldn't shake. Across from her, an investigator slid a recorder across the table. "Whenever you're ready," he said gently, his tone careful not to push. Priya hesitated, her eyes darting to the recorder before looking down at her hands. "I don't know if it'll make a difference," she said softly, almost to herself. "It will," the investigator replied firmly. "Your story matters." She exhaled shakily and nodded. "Clara, "She's always been like this," Priya began, her voice trembling slightly. "Mocking accents, ignoring complaints, acting like anyone who didn't look or sound like her didn't belong there." The investigator leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging but neutral. "Did you ever report her behavior?" Priya let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I tried once," she said quietly. "I told my supervisor after she called me the help in front of passengers." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she steadied herself quickly. "They told me not to take it personally, that she was just stressed." The room fell silent except for the ticking clock. Priya's eyes glistened as she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody cared until now." Her words hung in the air like an indictment, heavy and unshakable. The investigator nodded slowly and stopped the recorder. As Priya stood to leave, she glanced back at him and said softly, "I just hope someone finally listens this time." The camera lingered on the empty chair after she left, her words echoing in the stillness. The conference room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint shuffle of papers as investigators sifted through stacks of documents. The air was heavy with anticipation, each folder opened revealing more of the story no one wanted to admit had been there all along. One investigator, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, paused as he pulled out a memo stamped "Confidential," his brow furrowed as he read aloud. "Client comfort must always take priority over unnecessary escalations." He looked up at his colleague, his voice laced with disbelief. "Unnecessary escalations. That's what they called complaints." Another investigator leaned over, scanning the memo. "Look at the signature," she said quietly. At the bottom of the page, Clara Whitaker's name was scrawled in bold ink. The room fell silent for a moment before another folder was opened. This one contained a list of complaints filed by employees and customers over several years. The patterns were undeniable. A black passenger denied service because her ID was too worn. Latina employee reprimanded for speaking Spanish in the break room. Multiple reports of Clara mocking accents and dismissing grievances outright. Every single one of these was marked as resolved, another investigator said, her tone sharp with frustration. She held up a document stamped with the word "dismissed." Resolved by ignoring them. The camera panned to a whiteboard where phrases like "client comfort" and "reputation management" were scrawled in red marker, connecting dots between policies that had protected Clara and silenced everyone else. One investigator leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "This wasn't just her," he said grimly. "This was the whole system." The room grew quiet again as they stared at the growing pile of evidence. Outside the glass walls, the faint sound of protesters chanting "Justice now" filtered into the room, their voices growing louder with every passing moment. The office was unusually quiet, the usual hum of conversations replaced by an uneasy stillness. Clara Whitaker stepped through the door, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, but no one looked up to greet her. She paused near her desk, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. Her desk was bare. The framed photo of her receiving a Top Employee award was gone, along with the small vase of flowers she kept by her monitor. Even her nameplate had been removed, leaving behind faint marks where it had once been mounted. Clara's chest tightened as she placed her bag down and glanced around again. Her co-workers were there, but they weren't acknowledging her. A group near the coffee machine whispered quietly, their gazes darting toward her before quickly looking away. She approached one of them, a woman she had worked alongside for years. "What's going on?" Clara asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The woman hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "I don't know what you mean," she said flatly before walking away without another word. Clara turned to another colleague, a man she had once considered an ally. "You've seen the video, haven't you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted his tie and said quietly, "You brought this on yourself." Then he walked away too. Clara's hands, trembled as she sat down at her empty desk. The whispers grew louder now, sharp with judgment and distance. She glanced at her phone, its screen lighting up with notifications, articles dissecting the viral clip, comments demanding accountability, messages she couldn't bring herself to read. Her gaze dropped to the empty space where her nameplate had been. For the first time, Clara felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her like a physical force. The kitchen was dimly lit, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Clara Whitaker sat at the table, her phone resting in front of her. The screen glowed softly, displaying a flood of notifications, comments, articles, and messages she couldn't bring herself to open. She scrolled through the headlines mechanically. Flight attendant faces, backlash after viral clip. Racism in luxury aviation, a case study, so. Calls for termination grow louder. Her chest tightened as she read the comments beneath one article. She deserves everything coming to her. How many people has she treated like this? Fire her and everyone who protected her. Clara set the phone down abruptly, the sound of it hitting the table louder than she intended. She buried her face in her hands, her breathing uneven. Thato. Sound of footsteps broke the silence. Her husband, Mark, entered the kitchen quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything as he walked to the counter and poured himself a glass of water. "Mark," Clara said softly, her voice trembling. "You've seen it, haven't you?" He didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of water before setting the glass down. "It's everywhere," he said finally, his tone flat. Clara stood from her chair, desperation creeping into her voice. "You know me," she said quickly. "You know I didn't mean—" Mark cut her off with a sharp, "Look, I don't think I do anymore." Clara froze, her words catching in her throat. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring. He placed it on the counter gently but deliberately before turning toward the door. The sound of the doctor closing behind him was deafening in its finality. Clara stared at the ring for a long moment before sinking back into her chair, tears streaming silently down her face. Clara Whitaker sat alone in her living room, the curtains drawn tightly to block out the sunlight. The once pristine space felt suffocating now, its silence pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. Her eyes were fixed on the coffee table in front of her, where a framed photo of herself stood, a glossy image of her smiling proudly. At an awards ceremony, holding a plaque that read Top Employee of the Year, she reached for the frame slowly, her fingers brushing against the glass. For years, this photo had been a symbol of her success, her authority, her place in the world. But now it felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. Her phone buzzed beside her, lighting up with yet another notification. Clara glanced at the screen briefly. Flight attendant's career crumbles after viral clip. She didn't bother reading the comments this time. She already knew what they would say. Her breathing grew uneven as she stared at the photo again. The smiling woman in the frame felt like a stranger now, someone she barely recognized. Anger bubbled up inside her. Anger at herself, at Amara Johnson, at the world that had turned against her so quickly. Without thinking, Clara grabbed the frame and hurled it across the room. The sound of shattering glass echoed loudly, cutting through the oppressive silence. Pieces of the frame scattered across the floor like splinters of her crumbling self-image. Clara sank back into the couch, her hands trembling as she stared at the mess she had made. The plaque lay face down among the shards, its words hidden from view. The camera lingered on Clara's tear-streaked face as she buried her head in her hands. The shattered glass around her was more than just broken pieces. It was a reflection of everything she had become. The office was quiet, the soft hum of a desk lamp casting a warm glow over stacks of papers and an open laptop. Amara Johnson sat at her desk, her posture steady, her focus unwavering. The viral clip had ignited a firestorm, but she wasn't here to celebrate. It wasn't about that. Her assistant Maya entered the room hesitantly, holding a folder marked Equity Policies Draft. She placed it gently on the desk and stood back, watching Amara carefully. "It's all there," Maya said softly. "The changes you wanted." Amara nodded without looking up, her pen moving steadily across the paper in front of her. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Maya shifted slightly, breaking the quiet. "Do you think they'll listen?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara paused mid-signature and looked up at her assistant. Her expression was calm but firm, her voice steady as she replied, "They don't have a choice anymore." Maya exhaled softly and nodded, stepping back toward the door. She hesitated for a moment before saying, "You've done something incredible here." Amara didn't respond immediately. She returned to the document in front of her, signing her name with deliberate precision. "This isn't about me," she said finally. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The camera lingered on her hands as she closed the folder and placed it neatly on top of the stack. Each movement was deliberate, carrying the weight of years of struggle and quiet determination. Outside the office window, the faint sound of protesters chanting, "Justice in Aviation," could be heard in the distance. Amara glanced toward the window briefly before returning to her work. Her thoughts were steady. This is just the beginning. Outside, Skylux Aviation headquarters, the air buzzed with energy. A crowd had gathered, their signs bold and unrelenting. "Justice in Aviation! End racist policies! Accountability now!" The chants rose and fell like waves, their rhythm steady and determined. Amara Johnson stood at her office window, watching the scene unfold below. Her reflection in the glass was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The protesters weren't just here for her. They were here for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or excluded. Maya entered the office quietly, holding a tablet with live coverage of the protest. "It's growing," she said softly, setting the device on Amara's desk. The screen showed aerial footage of the crowd spilling into the streets, their voices echoing through the city. Amara nodded slightly, her gaze still fixed on the scene outside. "Good," she said simply. Maya hesitated before speaking again. "They're asking if you'll come down and say something." Amara turned to face her assistant, her expression thoughtful. "Not yet," she replied firmly. "This isn't about me standing in front of them. It's about them standing together." Maya nodded, understanding the quiet power behind Amara's restraint. She stepped back toward the door but paused to add, "They're here because of you." Amara didn't respond immediately. She turned back to the window, her hands resting lightly on the sill. "They're here because they've had enough," she said finally. The camera panned over the crowd below as their chants grew louder, their signs held higher. The energy was electric, unstoppable. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people refuse to stay silent. The final shot lingered on Amara's reflection in the glass as the chants outside swelled into a crescendo, a movement that had only just begun. The press room buzzed with tension, the air crackling under the weight of anticipation. Cameras flashed incessantly, their bright lights bouncing off the polished marble floors. Amara Johnson entered the room with steady strides, her legal team flanking her like pillars of quiet strength. She wore a tailored suit, her posture commanding, yet composed, her gaze unwavering as she surveyed the crowd. At the back of the room, Clara Whitaker sat slumped in a chair, her hoodie pulled tightly over her head. Her hands trembled as she gripped her phone, the screen lighting up with notifications. She couldn't bring herself to read. The once pristine flight attendant now looked like a shadow of herself, her chipped nail polish and unkempt hair stark reminders of how far she had fallen. Reporters jostled for position, their voices overlapping as they shouted questions. "Ms. Johnson, do you think this incident will change the industry?" "Amara, what's your response to the backlash against Clara Whitaker?" Amara didn't rush to answer. She took her seat at the podium and adjusted the microphone with deliberate precision. The room fell silent almost instantly, every eye fixed on her. Clara shrank deeper into her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around nervously, hoping no one would notice her presence. But the camera caught her anyway. A fleeting shot of a woman unraveling under the weight of judgment. Amara's voice broke through the silence, calm but firm. This isn't about one person or one incident. It's about accountability, something this industry has ignored for far too long. The reporters scribbled furiously as Amara's words filled the room, sharp and undeniable. Clara Whitaker sat motionless in the back row, her hoodie pulled low over her face. The fabric felt suffocating, but she couldn't bring herself to remove it. Her hands gripped her phone tightly, her chipped nail polish catching the light as she scrolled through endless notifications. Each buzz felt like a dagger, another reminder of how far she had fallen. The room buzzed with activity, reporters whispering to each other while their cameras remained fixed on Amara Johnson at the podium. Amara's calm presence filled the space, her voice steady as she answered questions with precision and grace. Clara glanced up briefly, just long enough to see the way Amara held the room's attention effortlessly. It was a stark contrast to Clara's own shrinking presence, hidden in plain sight. The camera panned across the room and lingered on her for a moment, a fleeting image of a woman trying desperately to disappear. A reporter raised his hand and stood. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice loud and clear. "Do you think this incident is part of a larger problem in the aviation industry?" Amara's gaze swept across the room before settling on him. "I don't think it's a part of the problem," she said firmly. "I know it is." The crowd murmured in agreement, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Clara shrank deeper into her seat, her fingers tightening around her phone like it was a lifeline. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes in the room, not on Amara, but on her. The camera zoomed in briefly on Clara's trembling hands before cutting back to Amara's composed face at the podium. The contrast was stark, power reclaimed versus power crumbling. The room grew quieter as the reporters settled into their seats, pens poised and cameras ready. Amara Johnson stood at the podium, her presence commanding, yet restrained. Her gaze swept across the room, steady and unyielding, before she nodded at the next reporter to speak. A young journalist in a crisp blazer leaned forward, gripping his microphone tightly. His voice carried a sharp edge as he asked, "Critics are saying you overreacted. How do you respond to claims that firing Clara Whitaker was too harsh?" The tension in the room thickened instantly. All eyes turned to Amara, waiting for her answer. Even Clara, slumped in the back row with her hoodie pulled low, froze at the question. Her breath hitched audibly, her trembling hands gripping her phone even tighter. Amara didn't rush to reply. She adjusted the microphone slightly, her movements deliberate before speaking. Her voice was calm, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "This isn't about me. It's about every person who's been made to feel too black for spaces they built." The words landed heavily in the room, their weight undeniable. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, capturing every syllable. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as Amara's statement rippled through them like a shockwave. Clara's face paled further beneath her hoodie as she stared down at her phone screen, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Her chest tightened as she realized Amara wasn't just speaking about herself. She was speaking for everyone Clara had dismissed or humiliated over the years. Amara leaned forward slightly, her tone unwavering. "Accountability isn't harsh, it's necessary." The camera lingered on Clara's hunched figure for a moment before cutting back to Amara's composed face at the podium. Clara Whitaker's phone buzzed again, the vibration rattling against her trembling hands. She glanced down at the screen, her vision blurring as she read the latest notification. Clara Whitaker, trending, the face of aviation's reckoning. Below it was a meme, a cruel caricature of her sneering face from the viral clip, captioned, "When arrogance meets consequences." Her fingers fumbled as she tried to swipe the screen away, but the phone slipped from her grasp. It hit the floor with a loud clatter, the sound cutting through the press room like a sudden crack of thunder. The reporters turned toward the noise, their eyes locking onto Clara in the back row. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Clara bent down quickly to retrieve her phone, but her hands shook so badly that she struggled to pick it up. Amara Johnson paused mid-sentence at the podium, her gaze flickering briefly toward Clara. But she didn't address her or acknowledge the disruption. Instead, she continued speaking, her voice steady and measured. This isn't just about one incident. It's about dismantling a culture that allows people like Clara Whitaker to thrive unchecked. Clara froze, her fingers tightening around her phone as Amara's words echoed in her ears. She glanced up briefly and caught her own reflection in a nearby window. The woman staring back at her looked nothing like the polished flight attendant she used to be. Her hoodie was wrinkled, her face pale and drawn, and her eyes hollow with regret. The reporters shifted their focus back to Amara, but Clara could still feel their judgment lingering on her like an invisible weight. Her breathing grew shallow as she sank deeper into her seat, wishing desperately for the floor to swallow her whole. The press room was empty now, the echoes of reporters' questions fading into silence. Amara Johnson stood backstage, her posture relaxed, but her mind focused. She was reviewing notes with her assistant when the faint sound of hesitant footsteps caught her attention. Clara Whitaker appeared in the doorway, her hoodie still pulled low over her face. Her movements were slow, almost timid as she stepped inside. She stopped a few feet away from Amara, her hands gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Amara looked up, her expression calm but unreadable. She didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch between them like a fragile thread. Clara cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she spoke. I didn't mean for things to go this far, she said quietly, barely able to meet Amara's gaze. Amara didn't respond immediately. She set her notes down and folded her arms, her eyes fixed on Clara with quiet intensity. I didn't mean. Clara started again, but Amara cut her off with a single sharp look. You never do, Amara said evenly, her tone carrying the weight of years of dismissal and humiliation. Clara's shoulders sagged under the force of those 3 words. Her lips parted as if to say more, but no sound came out. She glanced down at the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she tightened her grip on her bag strap. Amara stepped past Clara without another word, leaving the room with deliberate strides that echoed softly against the walls. The camera lingered on Clara's face, a mix of shame and desperation, as she stood frozen in place, unable to follow or respond. The silence that remained was louder than any apology could have been. Clara Whitaker stood alone in the airport terminal, her hoodie pulled low over her face as she stared out at the runway. The glass windows stretched endlessly before her, reflecting the planes taxiing in the distance. But it wasn't the planes she saw, it was herself. Her reflection was distorted by the faint smudges on the glass, a fractured image of the woman she used to be. The polished flight attendant with perfect posture and an air of authority was gone. In her place stood someone unrecognizable, her shoulders slumped, her face pale, her eyes hollow with regret. Outside, protesters gathered near the terminal entrance, their chants faint but unrelenting. Justice now! End racist policies! The signs they held were bold and unforgiving, their words echoing through the air like a judgment Clara couldn't escape. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the endless stream of notifications. Another headline caught her eye. Clara Whitaker, The Downfall of Power Without Accountability. Below it was a photo of her sneering face from the viral clip, juxtaposed against Amara Johnson's calm composure. Clara's chest tightened. As she read the comments beneath the article, she got what she deserved. How many people has she treated like this? This is what happens when privilege goes unchecked. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down on a nearby bench. She glanced at her reflection again, but this time she couldn't look for long. The fractured image staring back at her was too much to bear. The camera lingered on Clara as she turned away from the window, walking slowly toward the exit. Outside, the chants grew louder, their voices drowning out everything else. The room was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. At the front, a podium stood under harsh lights, its microphone waiting for the next voice to speak. Priya Patel stepped forward hesitantly, her hands gripping the edges of the podium as she steadied herself. The murmurs in the crowd quieted, as all eyes turned to her. Priya adjusted the microphone, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "I worked at the airline for 3 years," she said, her words slow but deliberate. "And in those 3 years, I saw things that no one should have to see." A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience, but Priya pressed on. "Clara Whitaker mocked my accent in front of passengers," she continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "She ignored my complaints when I reported safety concerns. She called me the help to my face." The crowd erupted in murmurs again, louder this time. Priya paused, glancing down at her notes before looking back up. "And every time I tried to speak up," she said softly, "I was told to let it go, that it wasn't worth making a fuss over." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she didn't stop. "Nobody cared until now," she finished, her tone heavy with quiet frustration and pain. In the back of the room, Clara Whitaker sat slumped in her chair, her hoodie slipping slightly to reveal tear-streaked cheeks. The cameras caught her face briefly before cutting back to Priya at the podium. The crowd erupted into murmurs again, some clapping softly in support of Priya's courage. But Clara didn't move. She couldn't. Her shame anchored her to her seat as Priya's words echoed through the room like an unshakable truth. The press room was buzzing with murmurs and whispers, the weight of Priya Patel's testimony still hanging in the air. Clara Whitaker sat frozen in the back row, her hoodie slipping further down, exposing her tear-streaked face. The cameras had caught her earlier, but now they ignored her entirely, focusing on the voices demanding accountability at the podium. Clara stood slowly, her movements hesitant and unsteady. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way toward the exit. The sound was faint but sharp enough to draw a few glances from nearby reporters. No one stopped her. No one said anything. As she passed by her former colleagues, their silence was louder than any insult could have been. A man she had once shared coffee breaks with turned his back to her without a word. A woman she had mentored years ago avoided eye contact entirely, pretending to be engrossed in her notes. Clara's chest tightened as she approached the door, her breathing shallow and uneven. She glanced down at the floor and froze. There, lying among scattered papers and broken glass, was a shattered plaque, the same top employee award she had once displayed proudly on her desk. A janitor paused his sweeping to glance at Clara, briefly before continuing his work, brushing the shards into a dustpan without acknowledgement. Clara stepped over the broken plaque carefully, her heels clicking louder now as she pushed open the door and stepped into the hallway. The sound of it closing behind her echoed through the room, like a final punctuation mark on her downfall. The camera lingered on the shattered plaque for a moment, before cutting back to the podium, where voices continued to rise in calls for justice. Ditsakuru. Screen glowed brightly in a dimly lit room, its feed scrolling endlessly with posts, comments, and videos. The hashtag #FireClara dominated every platform, trending globally within hours. Each post carried a piece of the story, amplifying voices that had long been silenced. A montage played out on social media, a clip of Clara rolling her eyes at a black passenger who had politely asked for assistance, another video of her mocking a client's hijab, her tone dripping with condescension. A former co-worker's post, "She called me unfit for first-class service because of my accent." Each video ended with Amara Johnson's calm voice from the press conference, "Accountability isn't optional." The comments were relentless. "This isn't just one person, it's the whole system. How many others like Clara are still out there? Amara is the leader we need." In her small apartment, Clara sat on her couch, staring blankly at her phone. The notifications buzzed incessantly, but she didn't have the strength to turn them off. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the posts. One comment caught her eye. "Privilege protects people like her, until it doesn't." Clara's chest tightened as she dropped the phone onto the cushion beside her. The words felt like a final judgment, one she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Amara sat in her office, watching the movement unfold online. Her assistant entered quietly and said, The hashtag is everywhere. Amara nodded slightly, her expression calm but resolute. Good, she replied softly. Let it be seen. The camera panned back to Clara's apartment, where her phone buzzed again with another notification. The screen read, Justice in Aviation. The reckoning begins. The airport tarmac stretched wide under a cloudless sky, the sun casting a golden glow over the planes lined up in perfect rows. Amara Johnson stood near her private jet, her posture steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The faint hum of engines filled the air, but her thoughts were calm and focused. Nearby, a group of young pilots gathered, their faces bright with excitement and determination. Amara watched as they boarded one of the training jets, their movements confident yet careful. Among them was a young black girl who paused at the bottom of the steps to glance back at Amara. Her eyes sparkled with admiration as she pointed toward Amara's jet and whispered to her mother, I want to fly like her. Her mother smiled softly and nodded. You will, she replied. Amara's lips curved into a faint smile as she watched them. She didn't approach or speak. Her presence alone was enough to inspire. Across the tarmac, Clara Whitaker stood in the shadows near the edge of the terminal. Her shoulders were slumped, her once proud posture replaced by quiet defeat. She watched Amara's jet from a distance, her face pale and drawn. The polished woman who had once commanded attention was now invisible, unnoticed by everyone around her. As Amara's jet roared to life and began its ascent, Clara's gaze followed it until it disappeared into the sky. The camera lingered on her for a moment before cutting back to Amara inside her jet, seated calmly by the window as she looked out at the endless expanse before her. The sky belongs to everyone. It's time we act like it. The final shot showed the jet soaring higher into the clouds, a symbol of progress that refused to be grounded. Clara Whitaker sat at her kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows across the room. In front of her lay a letter from the Aviation board, its crisp white paper stark against the worn wood of the table. She had read it 3 times already, but the words still felt sharp and unforgiving. Permanent termination. Her hands trembled as she picked up the letter again, her eyes lingering on the bold text that confirmed what she already knew. Her career was over. The license she had once displayed proudly, the symbol of her authority and success, was now void. She folded the letter slowly, her movements deliberate but shaky. Each crease felt like a final blow, a reminder of everything she had lost. Clara opened the drawer beside her and placed the letter inside, burying it beneath a pile of old receipts and forgotten papers. She closed the drawer firmly, as though shutting away her shame along with it. Her gaze drifted to the framed photo on the counter, a picture of herself in uniform, smiling confidently at an award ceremony. The plaque in her hands read, Top Employee of the Year. Clara stared at it for a long moment before turning it face down. The sound of her phone buzzing broke the silence. She glanced at the screen. Another notification about the viral clip, another headline dissecting her downfall. Clara didn't bother opening it. She turned off her phone and leaned back in her chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. The camera lingered on the closed drawer and the overturned photo before cutting to Clara's expression. Empty, defeated, and quietly unraveling. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as Clara Whitaker stepped behind the counter, tying the strings of her stained apron. The smell of coffee and grease filled the air, mingling with the faint chatter of indifferent customers. The once pristine uniform she had worn with pride was now replaced by this, an apron that never seemed to come clean no matter how many times it was washed. She moved mechanically, pouring coffee into chipped mugs and wiping down tables without making eye contact. The whispers started as soon as she walked past a booth near the window. "That's her, isn't it?" one customer murmured to another. "Yeah," the other replied, glancing over briefly before looking away. "From that video." Clara's grip tightened on the coffee pot, but she didn't turn around. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment sharp and unrelenting. A man at the counter cleared his throat impatiently, snapping her back to reality. "Refill?" he asked curtly, holding up his empty mug. Clara nodded quickly and poured the coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "Here you go," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the clinking plates and distant hum of conversation. Her former colleagues were nowhere to be seen. No familiar faces to offer even a shred of comfort. She was surrounded by strangers now, people who only knew her as the woman from that video. As Clara turned back to the counter, she caught her reflection in the stainless steel coffee machine, a tired face with hollow eyes staring back at her. She looked away quickly, focusing instead on wiping an already clean surface. The whispers continued behind her, louder now than the clinking plates. The bell above the diner door jingled again, and Clara Whitaker glanced up from the counter. A black family entered. A mother, father, and their young daughter, who skipped ahead excitedly. The little girl's laughter echoed softly through the room, a sound that felt out of place in the heavy atmosphere Clara had grown used to. Clara hesitated for a moment before grabbing a stack of menus and walking toward their table. Her steps were slow, her grip on the menus tight as she approached. "Welcome," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. She placed the menus on the table without making eye contact. The little girl looked up at Clara with bright eyes and smiled. A wide, genuine smile that caught Clara off guard. For a brief moment, Clara froze, unsure how to respond. Her gaze dropped to the floor as she cleared her throat awkwardly. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The mother glanced at Clara briefly before turning to her daughter and saying warmly, "What do you want, sweetheart?" "I want pancakes," the girl exclaimed happily, still smiling at Clara. Clara nodded quickly and scribbled on her notepad, avoiding the girl's gaze entirely. "Pancakes," she repeated softly. "Anything else?" The father shook his head, politely. "That'll be all for now." Clara turned and walked back to the counter, her movements stiff and mechanical. She placed the order without speaking to the cook, her hands trembling as she leaned against the counter for support. She glanced back at their table briefly but looked away just as quickly. The little girl's smile lingered in her mind long. After she had walked away, a quiet reminder of everything she had taken for granted. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation as reporters gathered in front of a podium draped with the Sky Lux Aviation logo. Amara Johnson stood to the side, her presence calm but commanding. She adjusted the microphone as the cameras focused on her, their lenses capturing every detail of this pivotal moment. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Today, we're not just talking about change, we're creating it." The reporters leaned in, their pens poised as Amara continued. "For too long, the aviation industry has been a space where access is limited, where opportunities are scarce for people who don't fit a certain mold. That ends now." She paused briefly, letting her words settle in the room before continuing. "I'm proud to announce the launch of the Skylux Scholarship Program, a fully funded initiative to support aspiring black pilots and aviation professionals." The crowd erupted into applause, but Amara remained composed, her focus unwavering. "This isn't just about opening doors," she said firmly. "We're building runways for talent, for ambition, and for dreams that have been grounded for far too long." A young reporter raised her hand. "Ms. Johnson," she asked hesitantly, "what inspired you to create this program?" Amara's expression softened slightly as she replied, "Because I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong, and I know what it takes to prove them wrong." The room fell silent for a moment before another wave of applause broke out. Amara stepped back from the podium, her gaze steady as she scanned the room. This wasn't just a press conference, it was a declaration of purpose. Her thoughts were clear. This is how we change the sky. The sun shone brightly over the airstrip, its golden light reflecting off the wings of sleek jets lined up in perfect rows. Amara Johnson stood near the runway, her posture steady as she watched a group of young pilots preparing for their first flight. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces bright with determination and hope. One of the pilots, a young black girl no older than 12, paused at the bottom of the steps leading to a training jet. She turned toward her mother, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mom," she whispered, pointing toward Amara's private jet parked nearby. "I want to fly like her." Her mother smiled warmly and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You will," she said softly. Amara caught the exchange from a distance and smiled faintly. She didn't approach them or say anything. Her presence alone was enough to inspire. The camera panned across the airstrip, capturing moments of young pilots adjusting their gear, instructors giving last-minute advice, and families watching proudly from the sidelines. This wasn't just an airstrip. It was a runway for dreams that had been grounded for far too long. As one of the training jets roared to life and began its ascent, Amara's gaze followed it into the sky. Her thoughts were steady. This is what progress looks like. Meanwhile, Clara Whitaker stood near the edge of the terminal, her figure barely visible in the shadows. She watched Amara's jet from afar, her shoulders slumped and her face pale. The polished woman who had once commanded attention was now invisible, unnoticed by everyone around her. Amara's voice echoed softly as her jet soared into the sky. "The sky belongs to everyone. It's time we act like it." The diner was quiet during the late afternoon lull, the clinking of plates and the faint hum of conversation filling the air. Clara Whitaker sat alone at a corner table during her break, her stained apron folded neatly beside her. She stared down at her phone, its screen glowing with a barrage of notifications she couldn't bring herself to read. Her fingers hovered over one message before she hesitated and locked the screen. The reflection staring back at her in the darkened glass was hollow-eyed and pale, a far cry from the confident woman she used to see. She glanced around the diner. The other employees chatted quietly near the counter, their laughter soft, but pointedly excluding her. A waitress walked past Clara without acknowledging her, carrying a tray of food to a table near the window. Clara picked at the edges of her sandwich, her appetite long gone. She could feel the weight of whispers behind, her sharp and cutting even though she couldn't hear them clearly. "She used to be someone, didn't she?" one voice murmured from a nearby booth. "Yeah," another replied, barely audible. "Now look at her." Clara's chest tightened as she stared down at her phone again. She unlocked it reluctantly and scrolled through the latest headlines. Former flight attendant faces backlash. From power to pariah. The viral fall of Clara Whitaker. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down on the table, its screen cracked from an earlier drop. The fractured glass mirrored her own sense of self, broken, scattered, and irreparable. The camera lingered on Clara's face as she sat in silence, surrounded by people, but utterly alone. The hallway outside Amara Johnson's office was dimly lit, the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoing in the stillness. Clara Whitaker stood there, her hands clutching a small envelope tightly. Her hoodie was pulled low over her face, shielding her from the world she had once commanded with ease. She hesitated for a long moment, staring at the polished wood door, with Amara's name engraved neatly on a brass plate. The weight of her actions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She raised her hand as if to knock, but froze mid-motion, her fingers trembling. Clara glanced down at the envelope in her hand. The words, "I'm sorry for everything," scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was all she had left to offer. After another moment of hesitation, she placed the envelope carefully on the floor outside the door and stepped back. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she feared even the sound of her footsteps might disturb the quiet. Inside the office, Amara sat at her desk, reviewing documents with calm precision. The faint sound of something slipping under her door caught her attention. She stood and walked over, picking up the envelope without opening it immediately. Amara returned to her desk and slid the letter into a drawer without a word. Her expression remained composed, unreadable, a quiet acknowledgement that some apologies come too late to matter. Outside, Clara lingered for a moment before turning and walking away down the hallway. The camera followed her retreating figure until she disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only silence. The room was alive with warmth and laughter, the hum of voices blending together like a comforting melody. Families gathered around. Tables at Sinclair's table, Amara Johnson's inclusive venue, sharing meals and stories under soft golden lights. The air carried the scent of freshly baked bread and the faint sound of children's laughter from a play area near the corner. Amara stood near the entrance, her posture relaxed as she watched the space come to life. Her vision had finally become reality, a place where everyone belonged, where no one had to question their worth or their right to be there. A young boy ran past her, holding a drawing he had made in the art corner. He paused briefly to look up at Amara and smiled shyly before running back to his parents. Amara's lips curved into a faint smile as she watched him go. At one table, an elderly woman leaned forward, her voice soft but animated as she shared a story with two younger women who listened intently. At another, a group of teenagers brainstormed ideas for their first community project, their excitement palpable. The camera panned to the glowing sign above the door, Sinclair's Table, where all belong. Its light was steady and bright, a beacon of hope that refused to dim. Amara walked slowly through the room, her presence calm but grounding. She didn't need to say anything. Her work spoke for itself. As she reached the far end of the space, she glanced back at the crowd one last time before stepping outside into the cool evening air. Her thoughts were steady. This isn't just a venue, it's a movement. The final shot lingered on the sign above the door as laughter spilled out into the night. The airport was bustling with activity, the hum of engines and distant chatter filling the air. Amara Johnson stood on the tarmac, her tailored jacket fluttering lightly in the breeze. Her private jet gleamed under the sunlight, its sleek design a testament to everything she had built, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Nearby, a group of protesters gathered just beyond the fence, their signs bold and unrelenting. "Justice in the skies! Equity now! Change takes off!" Their chants rose steadily, a rhythm of determination that carried across the airstrip. Amara paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She could see their faces, young, old, determined, and it filled her with quiet resolve. She didn't wave or approach them. She simply nodded faintly before turning toward her jet. As she climbed the steps to board, a camera captured her silhouette against the backdrop of the sky. Inside, she settled into her seat by the window, her movements deliberate and composed. The faint sound of engines roaring to life echoed through the cabin as the jet prepared for takeoff. Outside, the protesters cheered as the jet ascended into the sky, their signs held high as they watched it disappear into the clouds. The camera lingered on one sign that read, "This is just the beginning." Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you build for others to carry forward. The final shot followed her jet soaring higher and higher until it vanished into a boundless blue sky, a symbol of progress that refused to be grounded. The apartment was silent, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Clara Whitaker sat at her kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows across her face. In front of her lay an old photo encased in a worn frame, a picture of herself in uniform, smiling confidently at an awards ceremony. The plaque she held in the photo read, "Top Employee of the Year." Clara stared at the image for a long moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the glass. The woman in the photo looked polished, proud, untouchable. But now, that image felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost: the career, the respect, the illusion of power. Her phone buzzed. On the table beside her, its screen lighting up with yet another notification. Clara didn't bother checking it. She already knew what it would say. The headlines had been relentless. The viral fall of Clara Whitaker. Added, from authority to isolation. What? Accountability in aviation. A case study. She picked up the frame slowly and turned it face down on the table, as if hiding it could erase the memories. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the world moved on without her. Planes soared overhead, their engines roaring faintly in the distance. Clara's gaze followed one jet as it ascended higher and higher into the sky, disappearing into the clouds. She knew whose jet it was. Amara Johnson's legacy taking flight. Clara exhaled shakily and turned away from the window. She switched off the light, plunging the room into darkness. The camera lingered on the overturned photo on the table before, cutting to Amara's jet, soaring through a boundless blue sky, a symbol of progress that left Clara behind.